So, tier lists. You love them, you hate them. No, tier lists probably tend to take up unwanted space in most of our brains. You know, like, my character is so bad, and this character is too cheap. Reminders that your wife ran away with the kids. Well, how someone looks at a tier list is mostly up to them, but also related to how people that post tier lists treat those lists. Lately, it is rather common to see prolific players post and trade opinions while everyone else who doesn't have much of a clue will follow along like these are anything serious. Occasionally, you will find the person that simply uses these lists as a frame of reference on who to pick up for a more comfortable experience and a higher chance of short-term success. While this doesn't seem to be a common sentiment, I think that is just making the most out of a bad situation when we could be moving the culture and mindsets around tier lists to be more like how they used to be. Tier lists boil down to statistics and opinion, and sadly it is incredibly difficult for circumstances to align in a way where much sciencing can be done, but it can be done. The endeavor itself would also connect more people together due to how much networking would be necessary for the sake of a strong enough sample size. That said, I think it is worth doing. The main issue is how frequently a game might be patched. This effectively limits the amount of time that we have to sort out an incredibly high number of matches between a large group of people. This still shouldn't be a huge hurdle if organization is strong, but then there's another aspect of time to consider. Time for people to deepen their knowledge and polish what they're doing in a new game, or in a new patch depending on how drastically a character was changed. Still, making the effort is better than not because it helps give a clear idea for the developers on how to handle what they actually changed next patch. So, what do I think a tier list should look like? Well, trigger warning for event hubs. Here. As a disclaimer, I don't want to look at any of the specifics on the page or talk about who is where. It's completely besides the point. Focus on the math with me here. Let's start with taking the total amount of characters, minus 1, then multiply by 5. We subtract 1 to account for mirrors, then we multiply by 5 because that's what an even matchup score is, 5 to 5. The average possible score ends up as 85. This is important from a developer's perspective, because as a dev, there's generally a range you would want to keep any given character's score within. Johan being about 5 points ahead might not be a problem on its own, but you can look at the bottom tier characters or each past a hypothetical 5-point threshold by more than a point to see what to target first. Another important set of data to consider would be the amount of favorable and unfavorable matchups. 0 in both columns is technically balanced, but there's a high potential it is a rather stale balance. Kimberly here, again hypothetically, looks almost like a perfect example of what a mid-tier character should look like for matchups. Having a similar, if not even, amount of good and bad matchups typically speaks to a character having a healthy amount of strengths and weaknesses, but if the specific matchup numbers are too extreme, the character ends up too volatile in design. Enough design talk for now. Ignoring the voting, using a structure like this is ideal. My idea is to have a group of stat nerds come together that help network players then compare results, as well as weigh those results against tournament performance with extensive match analysis of the top-placed players. When tracking down top online players, I think the idea of taking time to analyze their matches and seeing if they pass the criteria is feasible. While that criteria is subjective, we can reach a point where it can generally be considered fair. A starting suggestion on what that criteria would be: 1. Reaction speed. 2. Decision making. 3. Consistency. And 4. Optimization. Now, to explain my reasoning for each, timestamp shown to skip the nerdsplaining. Reaction speed is part of your physical performance. You can look to scientific studies done on reaction time to various stimuli to figure out what would be fair to expect a top-level player to be able to react to with enough exposure and training. Not being able to react to an attack you need to block or avoid in a particular way makes you more vulnerable to that attack. At worst, like for low-level players, it is something that the opponent can heavily leverage against you. At best, an attack that forces you to choose between how to defend is part of mix-up statistics and leads into the next point. Decision-making encompasses a number of things for mental performance, but for now let's split it up into strategy and how a player deals with statistics in their choices. Strategy doesn't need much explaining. It's your game plan, like what options you want to leverage against your opponent's options, and what you can do to put pressure on the opponent to make more mistakes or wrong choices than you. Statistical strategy here is a fancy way of saying that fighting games are very complicated games of rock, paper, or scissors, or at least they tend to be. That's the best simplification that I can think of. One option doesn't always beat another all the time, and it can come down to a number of variables, like timing and distance. There is also the risk and reward to consider for using a given option. This could be an entire video on its own, and it probably will be at some point. Anyway, the suggestion on how to measure this is to first count how many mistakes a player makes, as in how many times they are hit. Next would be to count how many options each player has right before those moments, and try to weigh how likely it was for them to make those mistakes. For example, if player A was knocked down, but has an invincible attack, and player B does not have a way to avoid the attack besides give up their offense and block, then on the surface, that is a coin flip. We can weigh the risks and the rewards of the actions of either player to have a better idea of the range of how likely an option might be used, but it boils down to respecting the invincible attack or not. If player A is knocked down but does not have an invincible attack, we count player B's offensive options first on the assumption player A can only block or evade when they recover from being knocked down. Player B can throw the circumvent guard, or make the opponent guess to block high or low. Let's say reacting is impossible in this example. Player A needs to decide between avoiding the throw or not, and then if they decide to block, they have to decide which direction. This means the decision is split into 2 decisions, rather than 3, as a situation like this is usually referred to as a 3-way mix-up. This example is still too simplified, but I think if you are able to follow along you should be able to get my point. It's messy, but I believe it to be workable if someone wanted to put the time in and be efficient about it by setting up some kind of partial structure before actually getting into analyzing a player's matches to see if they meet the criteria. Consistency is a part of physical performance, and to a degree mental performance. Building muscle memory is important to be able to perform without having to think about and focus on doing it. Besides losing out on damage, having poor execution and being inconsistent with timings can leave you vulnerable to your opponent when you make such mistakes. An example would be a combo that knocks the opponent down, but depending on how you perform it, the amount of time you have to set up your offense for when the opponent recovers changes. Performing it correctly might allow you to use more rewarding attacks, and there are a variety of other consequences to which attacks you will be able to use on your offense. An easier example is missing an attack with a large amount of recovery and eating a bunch of damage for it. Don't believe the cope that some others might try to sell you. If you care about getting to top competition, you need to care about being consistent. Optimization, like consistency, can be considered part of how polished your play is. The easiest way to summarize it is being able to get the most reward for choosing correctly at a decision point. If you have multiple attacks or ways to evade that fall into the same choice, that's a bit different unless the risk of those choices are relatively similar to each other. The simpler part to factor in is how much damage you can get with your character off of a given option. Next to consider would be the resource cost, then next would be the opportunity cost. This requires a decent amount of character knowledge, and situationally weighing the difficulty of optimizing against what you might end up considering good enough. Again, this is just a suggestion of where I would start, and this would be an effort best made by a close community, rather than just a handful of individuals. Now to talk about subjectivity, and a variable we can't escape. The variable is that it is effectively impossible for 2 players to be exactly the same in skill. We can only hope that we find at least someone playing as close as possible to what we think is the possible best for a character, for every character. That alone is enough for people to flip the metaphorical table on the idea of trying to science out a more accurate tier list, but that's just giving up to me. We might not be able to reach that goal, but there is plenty of merit in the effort itself. The effort to grow ourselves, as well as with others. An effort to help the game grow. It's part of the experience. Together, let us become more involved, instead of growing disconnected, apathetic, and lazy. Now I just gotta remind myself to rework some of this as material for appealing to my wife to come back. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you have questions or any input, leave it down below. Or catch me streaming every day on Twitch.